called Apollo GraphQL, and I'm one of the main points of contact for our iOS and Android SDKs. And before I moved into DevRel, I buried a good number of the bodies in the Apollo iOS SDK. So if you're using it for your GraphQL needs and have questions, please, hit me up after this talk, either on Twitter or wherever you can, and I can try to tell you how to work around those bodies that I buried. I want to talk about something that, as someone working on making sure that people understand our SDK, really, really excited me when it was announced at WWDC this year, and that is DocC. Now, before I get into what it does, I'd like to make a few notes on naming here, since there are some things which this new framework could be confused with. So it's not DocC with an XIE, which is good, because when I first heard of it, I immediately started thinking of my friend Jen's miniature dachshund. And while Sailor Moon is adorable as hell and might make a good mascot for the framework, she is not quite what we're talking about today. And Erica Sadoun also pointed out that DocC with a Y has some other meanings that Apple maybe doesn't want to associate with their documentation framework. So to be clear, it is DocC, or you can even use emoji to talk about DocC. But the I's lie a little bit, because the C in DocC is not actually about seeing anything, nor is it for cookie. No, C is for compiler, and the LLVM dragon is here to steal your cookies. The documentation compiler is actually tightly integrated with the Swift compiler. After all, the Swift compiler knows a whole lot about the structure of your code and how your various types are named and interrelated. So they figured it could really help to make documentation better. So one thing that you do have to be aware of is that because it's so tightly integrated with the Swift compiler, if you're still doing development mostly in Objective-C, which is still a thing, though somewhat rarer than it was a couple of years ago, this is basically going to be a really good time for you to check your email. But if you are on board the Swift train, you might be wondering, where do I start? How do you get started with all of this new hotness? The good news is that you probably already are a good chunk of the way to having some super fancy documentation, because DocC looks at the functions, variables, classes, structs, and other code you've written, and grabs the associated Swift doc that you've created, or even the Java doc if you feel like you want to relive the 1990s. And when you select the schema of the library that you want to build, and then go to the product menu, select build documentation, it generates documentation that looks exactly like Apple's, which you can see right here in Apple's documentation viewer. In fact, if you forget to add documentation to something, DocC kindly adds everyone's favorite phrase, "no overview available," to your documentation. So you can really start to feel what it's like to be an Apple engineer. So that covers the basics of what DocC does, but there's three things Apple introduced which you can use to enhance your documentation. The first is pretty straightforward, and that's taking advantage of what the compiler knows to make your Swift documentation better, and other basic fancifications. The first thing that you can do is add links to your types in your documentation. In existing Swift doc, you can use a single set of backticks in a Markdown way to say, hey, when you render this, make sure to render this log level in the comment as a monospace font, so it's clear that this is a type. Now you can do even better and add two backticks to create a link to a Swift type. And since this leverages the Swift compiler, that means basically for free, when you use double backticks to link to something, you get autocomplete of the things that the Swift compiler knows about, which is super cool. This also means that when your type is rendered in documentation, instead of just being rendered as log level, it's rendered with its enclosing type, in this case, CodeGen logger. So particularly in the case of types that have scoped but possibly reused names, this can be really, really helpful in distinguishing exactly what the hell you're talking about. And when you click on the link in the docs, it brings you to the docs for whatever you've just clicked on. If you click on the link within your code, it brings you to the declaration of whatever you just clicked on, which is pretty neat. Another fun side effect of this is that if you happen to misspell the name of a class or other symbol, which I do all the time, when you build the documentation, DocC will emit a warning that you tried to link to something that doesn't exist. This is also super helpful for places where you're deleting code. If your docs link to something that no longer exists, you will get a warning right away. One minor issue I noticed on this is that if you try to create a link to an individual enum case, it won't work, but you can link to the overall type and just throw the name of the enum case on there after the dot, and it'll render it relatively reasonably. It's not ideal, but at least gets you closer than you were before. I will tweet out a link to a feedback to do once I actually manage to file it, if you're interested in getting this dealt with. A more annoying limitation is that you can't link to anything outside your own library, including the standard lib, because the context that the Swift compiler hands over to DocC is only your library's context. And again, I'm going to tweet out links to this feedback once I get it filed. The nice thing is that DocC will take your documentation for any particular symbol and then render the first line as the summary for that symbol and then the rest of the text as a discussion. And it will render any markdown links so that it's easy to create links to external documentation. There are some limitations to this, at least for now. And as developers in the Apple ecosystem, there are really three types of things that we normally work on. We have frameworks, packages, and applications. And this system is really designed to work well with frameworks, which sort of incidentally makes it work well with Swift packages. But if you're expecting this to be able to generate documentation for the public methods in your application, you are currently out of luck. And you would be able to see that if this was rendering correctly. Anyway, there's a certain extent to which this makes sense, since theoretically, it's built to help external people understand your public API. But particularly if you have a larger team, it would certainly be helpful for it to also help document public methods within an application. The workaround for this is basically to break as much out into frameworks as possible. Sometimes that's easier said than done. Another limitation is that you can't link to docs about things in related frameworks, even if they're in the same Swift package. This kind of sucks for Apollo, since we've pulled a couple of things that require third-party libs out into their own libraries, but we can't link directly to those docs from our primary doc set. Another limitation is in exactly what's getting documentation generated for it. There's a lot of different types of publicly available code that you can write. And the good news is that documentation gets generated for the vast majority of these types. The one really annoying exception is similar to the exception of what you can add with links, and I have to imagine is related, which is that any public extensions of types that are not initially declared in your framework will not have documentation generated. And yes, I did try this with both not declaring the extension public, but declaring the individual function public, and with declaring the entire extension public, which means that you don't have to declare the method public. Neither of these actually causes that method's documentation to get created. Again, once I actually get these feedbacks filed, I will tweet out a feedback number for you to dupe. Anyway, once you've gotten what you want, or what you can get documented inline, the next thing you can do is share your documentation with the world. So the first thing that you need to do in order to do this is go to the documentation viewer after having generated your documentation. And you go to the little meatball menu here and select export. What's generated is a DocC archive file. If you double click this opaque file type, it opens in Xcode's documentation window. The good news is that this file type, like many that Apple makes, is actually just a way of making a folder of stuff look like a single file. If you right click on it and you select show package contents to see what's inside, you'll see this pile of folders that looks an awful lot like a website. Unfortunately, if you just try to open the index.html file like you would for a statically generated site, you get a whole lot of nothing. And that's because under the hood, this is not a statically generated website. It's actually a Vue.js web app, which can only load stuff based on live requests. So you do actually have to deploy this somewhere to make it loadable as a web page. However, this is where a couple of good pieces of good news come in. The first is the way that the data is exported for the View app. It's just a bunch of JSON. Every type generates a JSON file, and then if there are methods or properties on that type, each of those gets its own JSON file as well. Now, this JSON is minified for use on the web, so it can be a little hard to read for humans. But the good news is that not only can the View app read it, but anything that reads JSON can read it. And while it's not yet public, the JSON structure, along with the rest of DocC, is going to be open sourced. In the WWDC videos, they gave the timeline as later this year, which, as far as I'm concerned, means that if it comes out any earlier than December 31st, I will be pleasantly surprised. Until that time, though, Apple has generously offered us some super easy instructions to deploy this to a website using an Apache server. Or at least they're super easy for anyone who regularly works with web servers. But to me, they are basically complete gibberish. The good news is that the open source community has stepped up to the plate here and created a suite of tools under the not at all confusing name DocC. Apparently the two Z's stand for ZZide, the name of the development company that worked on this. Luckily, they're at least a little bit better in naming their actual repos, such as serve DocC, which does basically what it says on the tin. It creates a small server for DocC using server-side Swift technologies. If you download a zip of the serve DocC repo, unzip it, and then at the command line, cd into the downloaded directory and do a Swift run serve DocC and pass in your exported DocC archive, it'll build a small Swift server that starts to serve your site locally, and you'll be able to load your documentation locally, and at least theoretically anywhere, deploy it anywhere that you can use a Swift run command. Now, I certainly am not the best person to ask on this, as my experience with server-side stuff is somewhat limited. But at the very least, you'll be able to view any DocC lib you have locally. And this is not the only thing that's available in the DocC organization. They also have a nice thing called DocC to HTML, which looks at the JSON in your DocC archive and uses it to generate a static HTML site based on either default mustache templates or ones that you provide. Now, it's certainly not perfect. I did see that it choked on a whole bunch of stuff in the Apollo DocC archive, but it does export things that it doesn't choke on, and even the default looks pretty solid. So if you're looking for statically generated HTML, this seems like it would be a really nice place to start. So I've covered a lot of what you can do in part one, which is just based on what you can do in inline documentation. But what if you want to keep going and really make your documentation much better and clearer for your users? You'll want to move on to part two of what's available in DocC, which is a way to create better information architecture than you get out of the box. Because when you go with what's automatically documented for you, there are a few shortcomings. There's nothing in the topics section. There's no summary. Everything is organized by what type it is, class, struct, enum, or whatever, rather than what it actually does. This is certainly more helpful than nothing, but it's a lot less helpful than it could be. So you know how initially the default flow just takes compiled Swift code and the inline documentation and uses it to generate your DocC archive. But there's a new file, or really folder type, called a documentation catalog, which can hold tons of supplemental information and which gets integrated into the DocC generation flow whenever it's present. Essentially, it gets merged with the information from the Swift compiler in order to create a more comprehensive and well-organized set of documentation. To create one, you head to everyone's favorite menu, the File, New File menu. And if you scroll way down to the bottom of Xcode 13, there's a new set of templates for files called, unsurprisingly, documentation. When you open the main documentation template, it creates something called documentation. And they don't really super recommend changing the name of that file, since the specific docs are linked to your framework through the name of the framework in this documentation template, which also has sections for overview and topics. One thing that I noticed is a very silly gotcha with this. I tried just setting up text in the overview section, but when I generated the documentation catalog, that just wound up generating a page that told me there was no overview available, and then immediately went to the overview section. So that was fairly annoying. I did eventually figure out that if you just remove that overview headline, The DocC compiler looks at this similarly to how it looks at header doc, takes that first line, uses it as the summary of your document, then automatically generates the overview headline and puts the rest of your doc below that. And you can write all this in Markdown with a few fun little tweaks, like automatic formatting of anything you start a quote block for with the words note, important, warning, tip, or experiment, with fun background colors for each type. You also can throw in Markdown images, which you can add alt text for as you normally would. One thing that's a little abnormal is that you don't need to put the full path to the image or its extension type, because images that are loaded by DocC are loaded from its resources folder, which takes images that are named very similarly to how they're named on iOS. And as you might imagine, this means that the default image is displayed while you're in light mode, while when the doc viewer detects that you're in dark mode, it automatically swaps out your image, which is pretty neat. I did find a fun bug where when you switch light and dark mode while the doc viewer is open, the image doesn't quite respond immediately, and you have to switch to another document and then go back to your original document before it properly reloads. So that's some of the ways that you can make all of this look nicer, but the main purpose of the doc catalog is to provide some structure to your docs. This is where the topics section comes in. Again, because this is all tied into the Swift compiler, you get both autocomplete when you're writing symbol links out with double backticks, and then after you build your catalog, you get warnings for anything where you've got a misspelling or a missing symbol. And the end result is that once you get past your overview down to the topics, things are organized in a way, way more usable fashion. After all, your users don't care if they're setting up something using a protocol or a class. They care about what they're actually trying to do with that protocol or class. The topics that you set up in the main documentation file also wind up extending to the topics sidebar, which makes navigation for users, at least within the Xcode documentation viewer, an awful lot easier. This also means for the pages for the individual symbols you're documenting, a See Also section gets generated at the bottom of that document so that users can get to other related things much more easily. I really recommend the Elevate Your DocC session from WWDC. They go into some high-level strategies you can use to organize your docs and make them easier for users to find. In addition to the organization features you get, you can also add Markdown-based articles to your documentation catalog, which wind up looking fairly similar to the documentation overview, and which are also available in the new file picker. You can link to them anywhere in your docs with a special link syntax that allows you to get autocomplete linking to docs as well. Articles are rendered a little bit differently in the topics section so that it's clear that this is more of an overview than raw documentation. Another thing that's nice is that if you want to go into a bunch more detail in your docs about a particular symbol, then you really feel like you can justify doing in the inline code. You can also create dedicated files that allow you to put tons and tons of detail that you don't necessarily want to have taking up space in your code files. And this type is called an extension file, which gets linked to the type it's extending through the symbol link that you create at the top. I will admit that I have not gotten this to work quite the way it's supposed to yet. I'm hoping that future versions will have some clarity on this. Unfortunately, there hasn't been an Xcode 13.1 beta yet, so we'll see how that goes. Finally, we have reached the most powerful and relatedly most complex thing you can do with DocC, and that is to write some really slick step-by-step tutorials. And these are all basically going to wind up looking like the Getting Started with Swift UI tutorial that's available on the Apple website. And the good news is you don't have to have any real experience with web development to do this, because Apple has created some extensions to the Markdown language called Markdown directives, which allow you to have a fairly understandable text structure that eventually gets transformed by the DocC compiler into a step-by-step tutorial. Now, this is the structure for the tutorial table of context file, which is basically the landing page users will see when they land on your tutorial. And looking at the code, you can see this can be the table of content for one-to-many tutorials, which has an introduction that lets you summarize what you're trying to do, and information about each chapter or group of tutorials. And there are links here to individual docs that are tutorial references. These are connected to tutorial files. which have a fairly similar structure to the table of contents, which lets you define a single tutorial to which you can add an estimate that will help generate these little time estimates in the chapter summary on the table of contents page. Now, the tutorial closure that has its own introduction, and then it allows you to define one-to-many sections which have their own introduction, which is for some reason called content and media rather than introduction, and then a group of steps that have one-to-many steps. And when this all gets rendered, each showing up as an individual step in the tutorial. For some reason, I haven't been able to get the images I've added to show up here, which kind of leads to an elephant in the room. And that is that there was an article that came out at the end of June that proclaimed that DocC was great but useless for iOS. Now, the title is pretty clickbaity, but the gist of the article was that this wouldn't be useful for large open source projects that currently use tools like Jazzy to render documentation in a custom way. Now, this did come out before the DocC ZZ stuff was released, and the author, Jesse Squires, subsequently acknowledged that they're working on a lot of the things that he complained about. But I think it leads to a pretty reasonable question you always have to ask about the new things that Apple introduces at WWDC. What is the intended audience for a particular tool? Because, spoiler alert, not every tool is actually useful for every use case. And honestly, the main audience for this tool is actually internal developers at Apple, who have a whole team that takes care of deploying all this stuff and uses the default documentation look. It doesn't contain an easy way to add different themes because actively Apple doesn't want them internally. They want to be able to have all of their documentation look uniform. It also helps to reinforce an ecosystem look for them if documentation is structured and rendered identically for third-party libraries. And that's part of why I think they released this publicly. There are a ton of people who are making frameworks that just don't have the time or inclination to go out and do the work to set up Jazzy or some other documentation rendering framework. Apple wants to give those people tools to do this themselves. And generally, people who don't have that kind of time or inclination also don't have the time or inclination to add those features themselves. The key thing to remember is that this is the first version of DocC that has been released to developers. In talking to the team that worked on this at WWDC, they really emphasize the importance of filing issues through the feedback app because it gives them an idea of the audience for something, and it also gives them ammunition when they want to get something prioritized. With that, we have come to the summary where I tell you what I've told you in the hope that maybe you remember some of this for longer than it takes to walk back over to the other side of your apartment today. DocC is a compiler that ties directly into the Swift compiler to make your documentation look super, super nice. You can get a ton of value out of this simply by improving and taking advantage of new features in your inline documentation, like symbol links. If you want to, you can use a documentation catalog to add structure and meaning to your raw documentation, which then allows you to do information architecture work to make all of your docs easier to understand and follow. There's also a really neat framework to allow you to add step-by-step tutorials to your documentation catalog, but it's a ton of work, and there are parts of it that don't work that great out of the box. And speaking of which, file feedback for anything that you don't like or doesn't work. This is the first public version, and Apple's team is interested in making it better to use across the board. With that, I've got some time to take a few questions. I'm going to post the slides, which I'll try to make sure are actually rendering correctly in the PDF. And they've got a bunch of useful links at the end, and that will hopefully help you understand more about what's going on. But mostly, I just want to say thank you all so much for listening to me today. Thank you. Let's see. And I know that one of our hosts was going to try to find some questions in the Slack, or I guess it's not a Slack, the Pine platform. Yeah, it's definitely they I know Bass used to work at Apple, and it's definitely something that's very big for them internally. And I think there were a couple of people who were surprised that it was going to be open sourced. But yeah, it's that part's really exciting. I really am looking forward to that because my team at Apollo is much more of a React shop than a Vue shop, and so they trying to get like a React app to display a Vue app inside of it is a little bit of a thing. So once everything is open source and we have something that's a little bit more on solid ground, then that's a place where you can start to create these plugins for all these other web frameworks, like Angular and React and all sorts of other stuff, and whatever. I always sort of joke with my friends who write JavaScript that like there's a JavaScript library for every word in the English dictionary, and then many others that don't exist in the English dictionary. But there's definitely going to be a lot of interesting opportunities for making plugins to make it easier to display stuff in whatever method you want once all of this gets open sourced. So yeah, Jazzy, Jazzy. So it's an existing framework that again, it uses your inline documentation, and then it's got a whole system for sort of customizing the way that your web page looks once it's done generating it. A lot of places like Dropbox or I know Realm uses it for stuff, and I forget what Jesse was using it for, but it's definitely a really, really powerful tool. But like most powerful tools, it's kind of a pain to set up. And I think what DocC really does is it says, if you want to have nice looking documentation, you don't have to go through all of the work of setting up Jazzy or something like that. You can just use Apple's template and have it look pretty great, like right out of the box. And again, like I said, I think this is a little bit of a branding thing for Apple. Like, it helps Apple to have other people's documentation look like Apple's documentation, because it gives that documentation some legitimacy. And it reminds people that you're within this Apple ecosystem. So yeah, that's a good question. I think, in terms of what I'd like to see from DocC, the things that I mentioned in terms of being able to reference either other frameworks that are within the same Swift package, and particularly being able to reference stuff from either the standard library or from like any other library that you've imported, so like UIKit or AppKit or whatever. Being able to make documentation that references those types, and particularly your extensions to those types, is really helpful, because I think it really is something that makes it much, much easier for you to have sort of a set of stuff that is properly separating all of your concerns, but that's still able to like link to different pieces of it. And I think that's a big one. In terms of what I think the open source community is going to do, I kind of am interested to see exactly what part of DocC gets completely open source, because obviously there's a bunch of the Swift compiler that's completely open source. I don't know what part of DocC is going to be open sourced in terms of like where the compilation is taking place versus here's what the format of the JSON is. They just sort of said, we're going to open source this, and gave absolutely no details, because of course they didn't, they're Apple. And I think that, again, one of the big things that I see as a possibility for what's going to happen is getting much better integration with web frameworks other than Vue.js. That's just something that Apple, I can completely understand them not really wanting to put that much effort into that, because it's effort that's not necessarily going to pay off for them. But I think it is something where, once that goes open source, I think you'll see enough places that use particular frameworks, especially big ones like React and Angular, sort of come together and say, hey, like if we team up on this, we can make this really, really solid for everybody. And having it be open source sort of is really helpful from a standpoint of just saying like, hey, we are committed to this format. We are committed to continuing to improve this and continuing to work with it. And, it would be great if one of the things that the open source community could do is fix some of the compiling bugs, but I don't know how much of that is plausible. It's gonna depend on what gets open source precisely. Okay, cool. Well, yeah, hopefully one of these years I'll actually be able to make it to Krakow with you guys. I was very sad when I had to cancel that trip in 2020. So one of these years we'll actually do this in person again.